London has a way of announcing ruin with perfect manners. The morning it chose the house of Ashford, the newspapers arrived folded like apologies, the horses on Bond Street kept an admirable tempo, and even the clouds arranged themselves into a sober audience. Yet inside the private room at White's, where fortunes are buried in silk, 3 men sat with their hats on their knees, and a 4th stood by the window, deciding whether he would rather be pitied or despised. Lord Gabriel Ashford, newly Duke of Merrow, had the face England lends to statues when it wishes to remember itself as noble. Clean lines, a brow that had learned restraint, a mouth that could have been generous if it had not spent so long calculating. He was not cruel. He had merely been taught that feeling is a luxury cheaper men cannot afford. This lesson had been his father's last bequest, along with a tangle of wagers, a ledger that blushed through its ink, and rumours so artful they might have been paintings, cards miscounted, debts quietly sold to gentlemen who prefer collateral in the shape of reputations, whispers that the late Duke's heir, Gabriel, had arrived a fortnight early to his christening and might be equally premature in claiming virtue. The solicitor cleared his throat with the piety of a man about to introduce arithmetic. "Your Grace, the estates may be saved, barely, but the city will not trust a letter from a Merrow. Only a contract the tongue is too vain to doubt." "Speak plainly," Gabriel said, though he already knew the shape of the sentence. "You must marry," replied Mr. Rennick, swiftly, respectably, absolutely above reproach. "Ah," murmured Lord Charles Deverell from the hearth, whose friendship had survived Eton, war, and 3 unwise operas. "A wife as a line of credit, the romance writes itself." The 3rd man, Gabriel's uncle, the spare who had never been required, shifted with discomfort. "A sound alliance will silence speculation," he said, "and erase lesser matters." He did not use the word illegitimacy. English gentlemen prefer their knives rapped. Gabriel did not flinch. He folded the Times with surgical precision and placed it on the mantel as if to spare the fire embarrassment. "Find me a name that will make the betting books close," he said. "Find me a lady whose virtue is so unarguable that even scandal grows bored." "Lady Eliza Harlowe," Rennick answered at once, as if the syllables had been waiting under his tongue for weeks. 22. Excellent lineage. Harlowe of Northmarch on her father's side, Trevelyan on her mother's. Dowry modest but liquid, educated, discreet, and— He glanced at Gabriel's face and edited the last word. "And suitable?" "Suitable," Gabriel repeated, tasting the safety in it and finding it grainy. Deverell, never safe, smiled into his glass. "The Harlowes are reduced if rumour counts accurately. An elder branch that forgot arithmetic. The sister, Miss Kitty Harlowe, is 16 and as pretty as an epigram, which is to say dangerous. The elder, Lady Eliza, reads too much, speaks too little, and has a spine one only notices at a second glance. I have danced with her. She is the sort of woman who makes you wish to improve your argument." Gabriel looked out at St. James's, where rain had decided to postpone itself. He felt, with the useless clarity that attends certain mornings, that the city would forgive him a crime before it forgave uncertainty. "Approach Lord Northmarch," he said. "Inform him that Merrow Hall requires a duchess. Inform him that I require a wedding before the quarter day." Rennick stood, relieved. "Your Grace." Deverell set down his glass. "And do you require a heart?" Gabriel's mouth tugged, not quite a smile. "Hearts are extravagances, Charles. We are purchasing quiet." "Very good," Deverell said. "Do remember that quiet sometimes shouts." The Harlowe townhouse on Brook Street remembered better days. Its carpets kept to their corners by habit. Its mirrors had long ago forgiven their owners for standing too close. In the back drawing-room, beneath a chandelier that had decided against ostentation, Lady Eliza Harlow arranged a spray of rosemary in a chipped vase. She was not a beauty in the fashionable sense. Her features were too intent upon their work, her mouth better made for wit than simper. But men who liked conversation found themselves forgetting to leave. Her mother, the Dowager Lady Northmarch, counted stitches with martial precision. "Eliza, my love, will you sit? The solicitor comes at noon to speak of the arrears at Charters Farm." "I prefer not to sit for arrears, Mamma," Eliza said, setting the rosemary where it disguised a crack. One grows superstitious. Kitty Harlow, bright as the ribbon she should not have been able to afford, flew into the room. "There is a duke at the door," she whispered, then remembered rank and said it louder. "A duke, Mamma." "Eliza," Lady Northmarch said, putting down her needle as if it were a sword she had been too careless in using, "do try to appear less capable. Men dislike competence unless they invented it themselves." Eliza smoothed her skirt. "If he is a duke, he has invented very little." The butler announced him with the tone of a man introducing whether he had not ordered. "His Grace, the Duke of Merrow." Gabriel entered not as a conqueror, but as a verdict. He bowed correctly, greeted Lady Northmarch with the courtesy owed to women who have held the line during famine, and turned to Eliza as one turns to a subject whose cooperation is essential and not guaranteed. Their eyes met, hers level, his guarded, a trained lion considering a violinist. "Lady Eliza," he said, "I am unfortunate enough to require a wife, and fortunate enough to have been advised that you are in need of a husband." Kitty gasped. Lady Northmarch closed her eyes briefly and opened them a general again. Eliza felt laughter rise, then discipline it. "You open negotiations with honesty, Your Grace. That is either very clever or very tired." "Tired?" he said, almost smiling. "Cleverness is for men who can afford delay." "Then we match," Eliza replied. "Okay, I am equally poor in time." Lady Northmarch coughed meaningfully. "Perhaps tea," she suggested to the room, which ignored her. Gabriel did not sit. "My situation is precarious. The Ashford name is bleeding. I can stanch it with a marriage the world cannot argue with. I am told yours is such a name. In exchange, I offer protection for your family, settlement for your sister, and an honest house. I do not offer love. I am not instructed in it." "Men are seldom instructed until they are contradicted," Eliza said softly. She looked down at her hands, the ink stain along one finger, the pale line where a ring might live. "I have no illusions, Your Grace. Love is a word tired women tie to carriages to make the ruts seem romantic. I ask for respect and room to be useful." "Useful," he repeated, as if it were a new instrument whose sound might suit him. "You shall have the running of the household, a portion for your mother, a dowry for Miss Kitty when she is wise enough to accept a boring man." Kitty bristled. "I shall never—" "You shall," Eliza said, smiling at her sister. "But later." "And you?" Gabriel asked, surprising himself by wanting the answer to weigh something. Eliza lifted her gaze. "I ask for the truth, even when it is ungentle. I ask that we never embarrass one another in public, and that in private we never pretend. I ask for gardens, a library, and the right to spend our money on people who cannot afford to be noticed. If I am to be a duchess, let there be dominion where it matters." Deverell, who had come as witness and defence against absurdity, made a quiet sound of admiration he disguised as a cough. Gabriel considered the woman before him. The steadiness without hardness, the economy of her speech, the absence of simper where other ladies arranged their futures. He had come to purchase quiet. He felt, inconveniently, a stirring of interest in the noise this woman might one day choose to make. "Done," he said. Lady Northmarch exhaled a prayer that had been waiting in her chest since Michaelmas. Kitty clapped before remembering to be tragic. Eliza did not move. "There is one more term," she said. "Name it." "When the world presumes sentiment, we will offer competence. When it demands spectacle, we will offer results. And when it asks whether we are in love, we will decline to answer until the work is complete." Gabriel inclined his head, as if accepting a standard on a field not yet cleared of fog. Agreed. The arrangements proceeded with the brutal speed of necessity. Papers were drafted, settlements executed. Gossip allowed to do the heavy lifting of advertisement. Merrow's creditors, discovering that romance had become policy, loosened their nooses to see whether a wedding could hold where bonds had frayed. A date was set that did not permit delay the courtesy of a second thought. They stood at the altar of St. Matthias before the lemon trees had exhausted their patience in the nave. Eliza wore ivory that had confessed its age and been forgiven. Gabriel wore a calm that misled no one who had ever attempted to breathe under water. Vows were said in the key of logistics. When the clergyman spoke of love as if it were a domestic animal, Eliza felt a small, perverse smile. Gabriel did not. Outside, the bells obliged the city to look up. Inside the carriage, as London rearranged its curiosity, Eliza turned her face to the window to watch it go. It was then, halfway down Brook Street, between a milliner who judged and a bookseller who did not, that Gabriel saw it. A single, quiet tear slipping like indecorous honesty down his new wife's cheek. She brushed it away with dignity so practiced it was almost invisible. He looked away first. Conscience, seldom invited to his counsels, cleared its throat. He spoke, not to console, he did not know how, but to acknowledge. "I will keep my word," he said. "I shall keep mine," Eliza answered, and their joined hands on the carriage seat, gloved, formal, touching only where appearance demanded, nevertheless felt, for the briefest unguarded moment, like the beginning of a treaty worth keeping. Merrow Hall had been designed by a man who mistrusted accidents. The facade declared symmetry the way a judge declares sentence. The staircases rose in identical opinions. Even the gardens obeyed geometry as if weeds were a moral failing. It was a handsome house and a difficult home, and it received its new duchess with the dignified caution of a butler receiving a revolution. Lady Eliza Ashford, née Harlow, lately wed by arithmetic, walked through those corridors with the composure of a woman who understood that grace is often a matter of pacing. She learned at once the choreography of a life built for exhibition, breakfasts at 9 with the newspaper ironed into docility, letters answered in a hand that erased doubt, tenants received on Tuesdays, the estate books consulted in a room where sunlight could not intrude upon ledgers. She did not complain of the cold, she improved the fires. She did not ask where to sit, she sat where work could find her. The Duke's study was the house's brain, orderly and quiet, inclined to mistrust adjectives. Gabriel lived there as soldiers live in tents, temporarily in theory, permanently in fact. He left early for the estate offices, returned late, with the look of a man who has spent the day persuading figures to behave and treated meals as negotiations at which knives were cutlery and also policy. Eliza learned his hours with the accuracy of a clock that prefers to be believed. She arranged the household to spare him spectacle and ensure him competence. It was, she knew, what he had purchased. At breakfast, they were civil in the way diplomats manage when the map has been drawn for them by other men's wars. Silver made its narrow music. Cups met saucers without incident. He asked after the stables. She reported the new foal with the gravity of Parliament. He observed that the south orchard required grafting. She agreed, and added 3 names of men who could be trusted with a blade. Sometimes he looked up as if surprised to discover conversation could be useful. Sometimes she did, as if surprised to find usefulness could be companionable. The staff, who had survived 3 duchesses of varying temperature, one spent money like weather, another collected charities as though they were parlour games, the third had preferred Rome to harvest, watched their new mistress with the professional skepticism of people who have learned to protect their own endurance. Eliza did not charm them. She noticed them. She memorized names and tasks in the particular way Mrs. Salter, housekeeper of 20 years and keeper of 12,000 secrets, liked her tea. She measured flour with the cook one morning, not to demonstrate virtue, but to understand bread. By the end of a fortnight, doors opened a fraction sooner when she approached. Eyes, meeting hers, did not glance away as if guilty of having been born. "Her Grace is tidy with money," Mrs. Salter confided to the under-housemaid, which in the Merrow lexicon was a confession of love. Merrow Hall offered elegance. Eliza added mercy. She had the nursery aired even though there were no children. She moved the footman's dining table closer to the fire. She ordered blankets for the cottages and sent them out without note. She visited the tenants with a notebook in one pocket and toffees in the other, as one should address both accounts and morale. She returned with lists and stories and a new awareness of how often roofs require diplomacy. Gabriel noticed if noticing can be done without altering the face. He heard of repairs completed without petitions reaching his desk, of disputes settled with a bread recipe and a firm look, of an old woman who sent up eggs for the tall one with the serious hands. At dinner, he mentioned once, he meant to be casual, that the east wing's windows had ceased to rattle. "Yes," Eliza said, buttering her roll with the composure of a woman who has signed an armistice with weather. Pollen was lodging in the sash. The joiner was shamed into correctness by Mrs. Salter. He nearly smiled. Still a cold civility held, a climate rather than a quarrel. At night he retired to his study, where the fire made an honest case for warmth, and he ignored it. She to the library, that benevolent, dusty democracy where books waited without guarding their affection. She read, standing sometimes, because fatigue sits quicker than sorrow. She read aloud, softly, when the house had forgotten how to listen. The volumes she returned to were not the sighing romances the town imagines women hoard, but poets who prefer accuracy to perfume. Donne's arguments with God, Milton's patience with loss, Shakespeare's willingness to forgive fools and princes in equal measure. She did not so much escape into the pages as report for duty there. It was on a Thursday that the weather remembered drama. Afternoon fell too fast. Wind inhaled and forgot to exhale. The first rattle of rain at the windows sounded like a question. Servants hurried their hearths into competence. Somewhere down the corridor a door complained and was reconciled. Eliza, halfway through a letter to a tenant whose pig had discovered a theological objection to fences, paused. The house listened in that way old houses do, taking attendance of its own noises, assigning them beds. Thunder announced itself with excellent diction. The lamps were lit. The library acquired the kind of gold interior afternoons wear when night is certain and patience wise. Eliza stood by the window and watched lightning draw grammar across the lawn, clauses of light, a dash of white at the horizon, a period somewhere beyond the ha-ha. She should have gone to bed. Instead, she drew a volume from the shelf, one that had acquired her fingerprints all week, sonnets, worn thin at the edges, her initials small inside the cover from a decade ago when possession had meant possibility. She turned to a page that had never lied to her and began to read aloud. She did not perform. Performance requires audience and charity. She spoke the lines the way one speaks to a friend one refuses to flatter. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Her voice was calm, not brave, clear, not loud. The house, startled, remembered how to carry sound. It lifted her words up the panelling and sent them along the corridor, past the stone bust that had always preferred Latin, past the mezzanine where a portrait of a boy ancestor had tired forever of being 14, and into the antechamber outside the Duke's study. Gabriel, ink-stained and webbed in accounts, looked up. Sound had arrived that did not belong to weather or debt. He set down his pen as men set down weapons when they wish to discover whether peace is possible. The words found him 2 lines later. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. He rose and crossed the threshold, without the house noticing. At the library door he stopped. Eliza stood by the mantel facing the fire, a book open, her head slightly bowed the way one bows to an argument that has remembered its proof. The lamplight made a domestic constellation of chair, hearth, hands. She spoke the last couplet softly, as if to spare anyone within hearing the violence of hope. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. He did not applaud. The line about error felt too intimate for clapping. He stayed in the doorway and listened to the storm congratulate itself. She looked up then, sensing weather of another sort. Their eyes met, not across a ballroom's manufactured astonishment, but across a hearth's earned honesty. He inclined his head. Forgive me. I heard— The weather, she supplied, closing the book. It is very persuasive. And you, he said, before discretion collected him. He added, more carefully, You read well. You account well, she returned, because compliments are safer when translated. He might have left then and preserved the distance that had cost so much to establish. Instead, a sentence, small, unemployed, honest, escaped him. Do you miss it? Reading? She asked. Not reading, he said, almost smiling at himself. Being read to, or reading to someone who isn't a ledger. She considered. The storm made intimacy plausible. I had a father who preferred sermons in poetry, she said. We read each other sonnets and accounts both. One teaches you how to bleed, the other where. Gabriel laughed, quietly, as if asking the house not to be alarmed. I have not been assigned poetry in— He stopped before the word years could pronounce judgment on his education. Eliza set the book on the mantel with the care of someone introducing a friend to a room. It does not insist, she said. It only asks. He nodded, and because retreat felt suddenly like rudeness, crossed to the opposite chair. He did not sit, he merely rested a hand on it like a man uncertain whether furniture has forgiven him for being human. The silence that followed was not the old, brittle kind. It was the kind one can live inside and grow warmer. A louder crack of thunder restored them to their stations. He stepped back. She recovered the tone of a duchess discussing lamps. If the storm holds, she said, the lower field will take water. I've asked the men to move the sheep at first light. He inclined his head, reassured by the familiar grammar of stewardship. Prudent. And the tenants' roofs, she added, will require diplomacy. I have learned you possess an inexhaustible supply, he said, surprising them both with the compliment's accuracy. She inclined her head. Good night, Your Grace. Good night, Your Grace, he returned, and left her there with the book and the fire and the storm that had, against policy, made the house feel briefly like a human enterprise. In his study he sat without the pen and listened a while longer for a voice that had read the word marriage without flinching. He did not name the thing that moved inside him. Men raised by scandal learn to mistrust nouns, but he recognized work when it presented itself. Something would have to be rebuilt that had not yet been built at all. By morning, the storm had passed and left the ground smelling like new grammar. Workmen set to the fields, Mrs. Salter set to the hall. Eliza wrote 3 letters and sent 2 baskets of provisions. Gabriel inspected fences and pretended not to notice he had slept less and felt more. The day resumed its chores, hopeful and unastonished. Far beyond the ha-ha, in the village that had learned to bow to weather before it bowed to dukes, coughs began to multiply into a rumour of illness. Eliza heard it first in a tenant's wife's apology for not paying with eggs. By supper the rumour had matured. By dawn, Merrow would be required to remember what its name was for. Illness arrived the way shame does, quietly, at the edges, pretending to be weather. It began with a cough in the miller's cottage that apologized for itself and ended the week demanding to be heard in every lane. By market day, the apothecary had run out of virtue bottled under Latin names. By Sunday, the vicar's wife had learned to boil water like a general. At Merrow Hall, reports crossed the threshold damp with rain and worry. Most were requests for coin. A few, more honest, asked for presents. Eliza read them at the breakfast table while the silver rehearsed its bright little noises. "It is not influenza," she said, scanning a note. "It is poor roops and damp straw and pride. They call it a fever only because fever is easier to confess than cold." Gabriel buttered bread with the efficiency of a man who does not enjoy arguing with facts. "We will send blankets and broth," he said. "Rennick can authorize the funds." "Blankets require hands to carry them," Eliza replied, folding the note, "and broth does not boil itself." He looked up. She had worn a grey dress that morning, the colour of work that intends to be believed. "You mean to go?" "I mean to be useful," she said. And the sentence did not ask permission. Protocol had its speech ready. Duchesses do not attend contagion. Charity is best conducted at arm's length. Appearances are a duty too. Eliza listened and then wrote 3 lists: fuel, food, clean linens. She sent messages to women who knew how to run houses on nothing and asked them to bring their knowledge in baskets. She informed Mrs. Salter that the great kitchen would belong to the village for a week, perhaps 2. She took off the ring Gabriel had placed on her finger and hid it in her pocket, not from shame, but from soap. "Take a footman," Gabriel said, the compromise of a man discovering that control makes a poor umbrella. "I'll take George," she agreed. "He has the sense to be afraid of women who know what they are doing." The first cottage taught her the syllabus of the week: smoke that refused to be disciplined by chimneys, infants who wished to cry and had mislaid the strength, men who avoided beds not because they were brave, but because they were needed. Eliza moved through rooms like a well-brought-up storm, upsetting nothing but inertia. She opened shutters, ordered scrub water, negotiated with a grandmother who believed strongly in onion poultices and stronger in being consulted. She changed straw, turned mattresses, set pots to simmer, and distributed blankets as if wealth were a temperature one could share. By noon, a rhythm had installed itself. The women of the estate formed a procession between hall and village: kettles, baskets, folded sheets, bread. Eliza's dress darkened with steam and purpose. Children who had been taught to curtsy to duchesses forgot the rule and clung to her skirt as if she were a tree. She let them. Word reached Gabriel before supper that Her Grace was in the miller's loft tending a boy with a rash like grammar across his chest. He put down his pen as one puts down a weapon that has discovered its enemy is hunger. "Harness," he told the groom. "Now!" Deverell, who appeared when a friend's dignity was in danger of defeating him, looked up from a ledger he had been pretending to understand. "You'll be in the way," he observed mildly. "I intend to be," Gabriel said, and discovered that fury feels very much like fear when one is married. He found her 3 cottages into the lane, sleeves rolled, hair escaping the prudent tyranny of pins. She was kneeling by a pallet, teaching a mother how to cool a child properly instead of drowning him in good intentions. Her voice was the same one she had used on the estate accounts, exact, steady, kind, because it was accurate. When she saw him, she did not blush at being caught in competence. She nodded once, as one officer to another. "Your Grace." "Report," he said, because titles sometimes serve to keep panic from remembering its lines. 10 families ill," she answered. 3 badly. The miller's boy, worst of all. We need dry straw, a team to carry beds into the sun, and someone to bully Mr. Copley into lending his still room for boiling linens. He will resist. He prefers selling tinctures to lending kettles. Gabriel glanced at the boy, at the wet hair plastered to a hot forehead, at Eliza's hand resting there with a tenderness his own had not yet learned. "Consider it done," he said. It was not, of course, but he did it. He discovered that his voice, which could make bankers consent to arithmetic they disliked, could also persuade a stubborn farmer to dismantle his pride for an afternoon. He ran supplies like a junior clerk. He carried straw bales on his shoulder and learned that labor repaints men without asking about rank. He stood in doorways looking foolish with a kettle and was thanked as if he had invented steam. Late, when the lane had decided against more emergencies, he found Eliza behind the church where the pump lived. She was washing her hands like a ritual. The water ran pink from a cut he had not seen her receive. He reached for a cloth. She shook her head. "Soap is the better, doctor." "You should rest," he said, hearing how ordinary the sentence sounded and wanting to laugh at its poverty. "So should you," she returned, and didn't. They worked together, after that not because romance required symbolism, but because the village required bodies who could count and lift. He held children who would not be held by their mothers because men are sometimes less frightening in crisis. She coaxed broth into people who had insisted on heroism until their stomachs corrected them. He watched her write lists in a hand the wind could not ruin, and discovered that he had married a woman no ledger could afford to summarize. She watched him mend a hinge on the baker's door, because drafts are promiscuous carriers of sin, and saw, astonished, the boy he might have been before duty taught him its grammar. On the 3rd night, while Rain argued with the thatch and lost, Gabriel found Eliza asleep in a chair beside a pallet, her head tipped back, her palm on a child's ribs to count breaths. He stood in the doorway and felt something move in his chest that taxes do not recognize. He reached to adjust the blanket on her lap and stopped himself because love is clumsy when it first decides to be careful. Instead, he took the chair opposite and counted with her, silent until the child's breathing settled into a truce with dawn. The week turned, as weeks do when work is honest. Fevers broke, appetites remembered their occupations. The miller sent bread to the hall because gratitude travels better in loaves. Eliza was slower in her step. Gabriel learned the weight of fatigue that is proud of itself. Then her strength broke. It was nothing theatrical, no collapse on marble. She set down a basin, reached for a jug, and the room tilted. Gabriel was there before pride could propose an alternative. He caught her elbows, felt the shock of how little she weighed under competence, and lowered her to a chair with a gentleness that surprised both of them. "I'm well," she said, which is what women say when they mean, "Do not argue while I renegotiate with my body." "You are not," he answered, and for once command served mercy. He lifted her hand, soap-dry, nicked, loyal, and saw the small blister where steam had educated her. He wanted to rage at the world for requiring such hands to serve it. He wanted to kiss the mark and felt ridiculous for wanting. He settled for bandage and water, the grammar of care. Back at the hall, Mrs. Salter installed Eliza in a chair by the fire and threatened the entire nobility of England on her behalf. "If her Grace rises before the kettle has boiled twice," she informed the house, "we shall take the roof off to stop her." Eliza tried to protest. The household ignored her with the relieving cruelty loyalty permits. Gabriel sat on the fender and read. Not ledgers, sonnets. He did it badly at first, too much Parliament in his cadence, but he learned. When she dozed, he kept count of the minutes, the way estate agents count rents. When she woke, he offered water with the humility of a man who had discovered the geography of a single throat can be more important than any map. "You read," she said, amused at the novelty. "I listen," he corrected, and the correction was true. By the time the fever in the village had become a story rather than a schedule, Merrow Hall had changed its climate. Doors did not open wider, they opened earlier. The footman laughed in the kitchen without fear of being edited. In the study there were still debts, but they no longer dictated the hour at which a man remembered kindness. In the library, the book Eliza had read stood open on the mantel, as if the house had decided to keep a candle in it. On the last evening of the worst week, they walked the short stretch between hall and village together, not as a duke and a duchess displaying policy, but as two people whose boots had learned the same mud. The sky had borrowed colour from peaches, the hedgerows practised recovery. "Thank you," Gabriel said, because the vocabulary of gratitude is a narrow lane, and one must use it anyway. "For what?" Eliza asked, weary and luminous in the way the useful sometimes are. "For saving Merrow," he said, and when she looked at him he did not retreat to irony. "Not the estates, the word." She hesitated, then inclined her head. "You carried kettles, Your Grace. That is not nothing." "It is not the thing," he replied quietly. "The thing was your hand on a child counting breath and teaching me to breathe in time." For a moment they walked without speaking, because anything else would have been interference. Then Eliza said very softly, "We are not friends yet." "No," he agreed, "but we have run out of enemies between us." A wind lifted the hair at her temple. He pretended not to notice, he wanted to touch it. The path narrowed. Without thinking, he stepped behind her, and then beside her again. The choreography of men who have decided to escort rather than command. At the gate to the churchyard, she paused. "Tomorrow I shall return the kitchen to Mrs. Salter, and the village to itself," she said. "And we will go back to breakfast at 9, as if dignity were a sacrament." "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall keep breakfast at 9 and add something to it." "What?" she asked, half smiling. "Tea that is not boiled to death," he said, and the laugh that escaped her belonged to a woman who might one day laugh without asking permission of grief. Behind them, Merrow Hall observed its owners with the proprietary affection old houses sometimes develop when their people surprise them. Ahead, the village breathed like a creature whose fever has broken. Between the two, a marriage walked, still tidy, still negotiated, but now carrying warmth the ledger had not budgeted. Autumn arrived precisely as if Merrow had written to it in advance. The hedges put on their burnished arguments, the orchards conceded their fruit, and the first frost signed its delicate initials on the lawn. Within, the house kept to its new, warmer grammar, doors opening earlier, voices softened by usefulness, breakfast, punctual, and mercifully unboiled. The village's fever lived now only in stories that ended with bread. Eliza, thinner but brighter, had resumed the quiet dominion of lists. Gabriel, less haunted by ledgers than by memories of kettles, found that numbers behaved better when one remembered to be human. Peace is a suspicious creature. It glances over its shoulder. It expects mail. The letter that ruined the afternoon bore an honest seal. Mr. Rennick's hand, too, had always been impeccable. No loops wasted, no flourish to tempt doubt. Gabriel slit it in the study with the small impatience of men who suppose they have already read what paper intends to say. He found instead a neat disaster. "Your Grace," it began, "in reviewing the settlements made at the time of your marriage, I must clarify an instrument executed through Messrs. Hargreaves and Lane, at my instruction, to wit, a dowry loan advanced against Lady Eliza's fortune to satisfy immediate liens upon Merrow prior to quarter-day, the same to be replenished from Lady Eliza's trust within 12 months. This course was taken to protect your name and estates from execution. I regret any misapprehension arising from my omission to trouble you with particulars during that delicate period." The words continued, making apologies in perfect handwriting. Gabriel stopped halfway through an explanation of interest terms that sounded suspiciously like virtue. A heat rose that had nothing to do with the fire. He saw stupidly, belatedly, the shape Rennick had drawn around his pride, Eliza's fortune, which he had imagined as a clean, providential river, had in fact been diverted by men making sluice gates out of her future. The estates had been rescued with money that was not hers yet. The scandal he had meant to outpace had been outrun only by her name, her credit, her risk. It should have humbled him. It found his old education instead. Pride is an accountant. It adds the wrong things masterfully. He folded the letter as though politeness could break its bones and went in search of his wife. Eliza was in the small morning room, arranging late roses with the practical tenderness she reserved for beauty that had done its duty and wanted only to be believed. She looked up at his step, read the weather in his face, and straightened. "Something has occurred," she said, not asking. He handed her the letter without preface. She read it once, then again, and did not pale. She had been present at her own life. Surprises were for people who had delegated. "Yes," she said softly when she reached the end. "I knew Rennick would tell you. He meant to spare you the insult of learning it in the clubs." "You knew," Gabriel said. The two syllables carried more winter than grammar. "I did," she answered. "I should have told you. I thought—" She stopped because the truth sounded too much like an apology, and she was not sorry. "I thought the house needed rescue more than your pride needed ceremony." "My pride," he said, and laughed once, a short, unhandsome sound that made the roses wince. "My pride required the courtesy of being consulted when my wife mortgaged her future in my name." "In our name," she corrected, and flinched only after the pronoun left her mouth. "It was my choice, my money, my risk." "Arranged by my solicitor," he said. "To save my name, with your trust, without my knowledge." He turned away as if the window could testify. "There is a word for this." "Kindness," she said. "Deceit," he replied. The silence that followed was not the good kind. It had sharp edges. It bled on the carpet. Eliza set the letter on the table as one sets down a scalpel that has already done what it was needed for. I did not lie to you, she said. I married you under terms we both understood. I offered usefulness. This was useful. You offered respect, he said. Respect does not spend another's future without asking. Respect also does not allow one's husband to be ruined publicly when prevention is private and immediate, she answered, and her voice, though steady, carried the fatigue of weeks spent convincing death to postpone itself. Rennick explained the structure. I agreed to it. I would do so again. You should not have had to decide, he said, the sentence landing unexpected even to his own ears. No, she agreed. But I did. He closed his eyes. The truth, having escaped, refused to be caged. You have made me your debtor. I have made you my partner, she replied. If that debt offends, send me the bill. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not a duchess defending a ruse, but a woman who had carried buckets through a fever and found herself scolded for damp shoes. 100 wiser words presented themselves and were dismissed like servants in the wrong livery. You should have told me, he said again, because repetition is pride's lullaby. Eliza's hands, which could coax bread from stubborn flour and peace from stubborn men, folded over one another with ceremony. Very well, she said. Then hear it now. I authorized a loan against my trust. It saved Merrow from auction. It purchased us time to be decent. I do not repent. Her chin lifted the smallest degree. I will not apologize for saving the house I live in. He flinched. You speak as though I were a house. You are, she said, not unkindly. And I am trying to make you habitable. Anger prefers enemies. It falters before accuracy. He reached for it anyway. Is this why you married me? To practice architecture on a ruin? No, she said, almost smiling at the absurdity. I married you to rescue Kitty's portion and to make the best of what the world had left me. Love was not a term in our contract. Integrity was. I have kept mine. Have I not? He demanded. She considered. Honesty is a dowry she had brought from a poorer house. You have kept it to yourself, she said, which is not the same thing. He recoiled as though the truth had poor breeding. I will repay the loan at once. You cannot, she answered, gentle in the way one is with a child who wants to outrun arithmetic. Not without selling land that feeds people, not without undoing the work we have done. I will find a way, he said, and the old, cold Duke stepped back into his posture. Very well, she replied, and the room chilled a degree. Find it. He left then, badly, with the haste of men who wish to be followed, and know they must not be. The study received him like an accomplice. He wrote 3 letters to bankers with impeccable reputations for refusing to be human. He summoned Rennick, who arrived with the tired courage of a man who has seen marriages attempt accountancy. They argued politely. Numbers performed their bleak ballet. None of it made him less wrong. In the morning, the house remembered winter. Breakfast returned to its ceremonial distance. The paper rustled like condemnation. Eliza moved through rooms with the old pre-fever care, useful, yes, but withdrawn, as one is in a museum where touching is forbidden. Mrs. Salter, who loved no one enough to flatter them, glared at Gabriel as if he were an undercooked pudding. You will eat properly, Your Grace, she said. If you mean to starve, do it out of doors. Deverell arrived with a face that had learned discretion and a voice that preferred trouble honest. I have read Rennick's letter, he said after 2 minutes of friendship, that pretended to be cards. You are behaving like a man who has mistaken injury for insult. Which am I? Gabriel asked. Injured by circumstance, Deverell said, insulted by a woman's competence. He poured 2 fingers of brandy and did not offer it. "Apologize? For being deceived?" "For being late," Deverill said. "She saved your name before you had time to decide whether it deserved saving." Gabriel said nothing. Pride is a cathedral. Confession echoes there without being believed. That night, Eliza did not go to the library. She walked the north terrace until the cold wrote prudence across her cheeks, and then sat at her small desk and wrote to Kitty. "The house is sound. The accounts will hold. How do you like Mrs. Netherby's son? He is boring. Excellent news." She signed it E because names take energy. When she finally slept, it was the sleep of women who have forgotten how to dream safely. Gabriel, in the study, fell asleep in a chair that kept his back perfectly upright, as if penance looked better with posture. Days arranged themselves in this discourteous order. Letters were exchanged with men who mistook caution for character. Eliza resumed visiting the tenants, the poor require no interval for married quarrels, and returned with news of a roof, a calf, a boy who had learned to read a whole sentence without tripping. She did not volunteer the reports, he did not ask. The house remembered how to carry sound away from rooms that deserved it. And yet, the thaw had not been entirely forgotten. In the library, the sonnets remained on the mantel, open at a page that made no sense to angry men. In the village, a miller's boy recited a prayer for the tall Duke with serious hands. In the kitchen, Mrs. Salter kept 2 bowls warming longer than recipes require. Winter is patient. So is love, when it has chosen good work. But both prefer a spark. It arrived, as such things do, not by intention but by accident with terrible timing, a bell in the night, a breathless groom, a word no household ignores. Fire. Somewhere beyond the orchard, the orphan house had lit itself like a confession. Eliza was already at the door when the alarm reached the hall. Gabriel reached it at the same instant. They looked at one another, the letter and its pride still between them, and found that the body knows before the mind what loyalty requires. "Go," he said. "I am," she answered. They ran into the cold together, the house behind them shivering at the shock of being right about both of them. Night was already thin with frost when the bell found its voice. It clanged the way fear does, without grammar, without permission, and Merrow answered like a creature startled awake. Doors opened, boots collided with stone. The courtyard, usually so punctilious, forgot which way was east. Beyond the orchard, a column of smoke wrote a black exclamation against a sky that had intended to be merely cold. The orphan house was on fire. Eliza ran without cloak or hat, because children do not measure temperature. Her skirts took on water where the grass hoarded it. Her breath made small, astonished ghosts. Behind her, Gabriel matched her stride. No orders, no titles, only pace. When the lane narrowed, he fell half a step behind, the instinct of a soldier keeping a back safe. Deverill appeared from the dark with a rope and a curse that ended in a prayer. And the 3 of them crested the hill together as the flames revealed their arithmetic. The orphan house had been honest timber and stubborn brick. Now it was a torch. Fire had begun at the back, where the kitchen chimney sulked, then climbed greedily to the dormers where night kept children. Villagers formed a line with buckets that seemed first like hope and then like ceremony. The matrons stood outside, counting with a ferocity only accountants and mothers possess. 7 out, the taller cried. 2 not found. Annie and Tom. Her voice broke on the second name and gathered itself again. They sleep under the eaves. Eliza, Gabriel said, already stripping off his coat. He did not say don't. He did not for once mistake protection for interruption. South stairs, he added, because direction is mercy. Smoke met them at the door like a jealous host. Heat lifted a hand and pressed. The hall, which by daylight was a grammar of scrubbed benches and orderly pegs, had become a corridor of moving shadow and animal sound. Eliza bound a wet kerchief over her mouth. Gabriel did the same. Deverell shouldered past with a beam pulled from the fence for battering if needed. "In and out," he said cheerfully, which is how Englishmen translate panic for public use. They took the stairs at a run and then at a crawl when steps complained. On the landing, Heat spoke in sentences, Smoke in clauses. Eliza's eyes streamed. Her lungs learned a new, unpleasant trick. She counted doors because numbers do not disgrace you when you are afraid. 1, 2, 3. The fourth was stuck. Gabriel put his shoulder to it, and the door remembered its obligation to yield. Inside the room was a night within a night. Smoke made the world small. Flame made it sudden. 2 narrow beds under the sloped ceiling, a wooden horse with one wheel, a pair of shoes lined like punctuation. "Annie!" Eliza shouted, and the room told her to be quiet. "Tom!" she tried, lower. A cough answered from the corner like an apology. She found the girl under the bed, as all good sense recommends when the sky is on fire. Annie's eyes were too large for her face. Her hair had mistaken soot for fashion. Eliza slid to her belly, reached, felt a wrist thin as a pinion, and drew her out. "Up, mouse," she said, because endearments are levers. Annie clutched at her with the ferocity of the rescued. "Tom," the child coughed. "Tom's in the cupboard. He hides there from thunder." Gabriel was already at the cupboard, wrenching. Smoke pushed at his back as if to hurry cowardice into him and found none. The door came free with a noise that woke the roof. The boy within, that stubborn, brave thunder refugee, blinked at a duke as at an unhelpful angel and then went limp with relief. Gabriel lifted him. The weight was nothing and everything, a small, very specific life. The corridor behind them was flame imagining itself a musician. Beams began to argue with gravity. Deverell appeared through the smoke, a biblical figure armed with rope, and shouted something about the north stairs, thinking well of themselves. Eliza wrapped Annie in the shawl of her own skirt and handed the child to Deverell, who slung her over a shoulder with the insouciance of an uncle the world had not assigned, and vanished toward safety. Gabriel shifted Tom in his arms. "Go," he told Eliza, and for once the word did not mean leave me. It meant I am beside you even when I'm not. They moved, stair by stair, as if knees were a language they had only lately learned. At the turn, the floor made a decision to be less floor and more opinion. Gabriel tested a board and nearly fell through the argument. Eliza grabbed his sleeve, and in the most domestic of gestures she had ever performed in a burning house, tucked his hand firmly around Tom's body again. "You do not drop him," she said. "I do not drop him," he repeated, as if the vow were a sacrament. At the foot of the stairs, the hall opened into something like air. Deverell tore the door wider. Villagers bellowed approval or instructions or simple courage. Cold hit them like water remembers. Gabriel handed Tom to a woman whose heart had been waiting for that specific boy since he was 3. Eliza stumbled past him and into the yard where breath rediscovered itself rudely. Fire liked being admired. It leaned forward, obliging them to step back, but someone shouted that the far loft still held blankets and perhaps a ledger, and, more importantly, to the matron, Mary's Bible, which belonged to nobody and everyone. Eliza turned. "I will fetch the blankets," she began. "You will not," Gabriel said, finding command exactly where love keeps it for emergencies. He caught her wrist, gently, finally, and changed his voice. "You have done enough." It was a sentence no one had spoken to her this year, and for a moment exhaustion recognized itself. Then a cry tore through the yard, a high, contrary treble that insisted on injustice even at the edge of salvation. Annie, refusing to be comforted by anyone but a particular woman, was trying to twist free from the matron's lap to run back into the house for a wooden horse that had been allotted too much importance by a very small jury. Eliza knelt, drew the child to her, and understood at once. "The horse?" she said. Annie nodded, hiccuping. "He does not like fire," the child said, with the exact logic of grief. Eliza looked at Gabriel. "Some decisions are foolish, some are holy, a few are both." "The horse?" she whispered. "I'm already gone," Gabriel answered, and was. He vanished with Deverell into the red-lit mouth. Time performed its cruel trick of halting and sprinting. Villagers prayed in fragments. The roof considered ruin aloud. Eliza held Annie as if human arms were allowed to bargain with physics. Then, as if to remind reputations that they are poor narrators, Gabriel reappeared, filthy and coughing and incomprehensibly holding a one-wheeled wooden horse like a banner. Behind him, Deverell swore affectionately at a beam and ducked. The yard erupted the way fields do when rain returns after a vow of drought. "Ridiculous," Gabriel wheezed, pressing the toy into Annie's arms. "But necessary." Annie sniffed, declared the horse brave, and permitted herself to sob properly onto Eliza's shoulder. Eliza laughed and cried and coughed all at once, which is the correct grammar of relief. She looked up to thank him, to say something that risked being a sentence, and in that instant the house, resentful of being defied, made its final bid for drama. A section of the south wall lurched, thought better of it, and then fell anyway. Gabriel saw it before she did. He moved without thought, the body remembering what the mind wastes time naming. He hit her like a shield, driving her to the ground, and covering her with his own weight as debris shattered where she had been standing. The sound was stone-learning humility. For a heartbeat, breath belonged to neither of them. Then the world returned, embarrassed, and let them go. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, hands frantic at her shoulders. "Only married," she managed, and realized her hands were on his face without having asked permission. Soot made him absurdly young, blood made him briefly mortal. She wiped at the cut on his temple with a corner of her sleeve. "You idiot," she added, voice breaking. "Yes," he said, dazed and smiling the way men smile when the thing they nearly lost is heavier than a name. "But a useful one." They rose together, slow, and the yard received them with the impolite intimacy communities keep for people who have just argued with death and won. Buckets continued their procession. The roof finished falling within the lines of prudence. The fire, robbed of children and horses and final acts, sulked. When the worst was past and the sky resumed possession of the night, Eliza found Gabriel sitting on an upturned barrel, elbows on knees, head down as if listening to the earth explain something. She went to him, not as duchess to duke, not as debtor to creditor, but as a woman who had seen a man carry a 2-stone child and an 8-ounce toy as if they weighed the same in heaven. She touched the back of his neck, a gesture she had never practiced and found native. "I was wrong," he said into his hands. She sat beside him. "About what?" "About everything I mistook for dignity that was merely fear," he answered. He lifted his head. The cut had clot. The eyes had learned a new language. "You saved them. You saved the hall. You saved my name before I deserved it. Tonight you let me try to save you, and I discovered I would rather lose Merrow than live in it without you." Something very old in her went quiet then, as elsewheres shut their doors. "Do not say things you cannot keep," she murmured, not to wound, but to warn. "I am done with promises I have not learned the price of," he said. "I will pay for this sentence all my days if I must. I love you." She laughed, small, incredulous, not unbelieving. "You choose a battlefield well." He gestured at the charred timbers, the shivering survivors, the toy horse anchored now in Annie's fierce grip. Love should begin where pride ends. He swayed, she saw it, and stood at once. "You are bleeding," she said, brisk again, because that is how women rescue men from declarations that might make them faint. "Come home." "Home," he repeated, as if the word were a room he had seen from the outside until now. He let her put his arm over her shoulder, and together they walked back down the lane that smelled of smoke and something gentler crawling back into the world. Villagers bowed without noticing they had done it. At Merrow's door, Mrs. Salter took one look and declared 2 baths, 3 bowls, and an oath. Deverell slumped against the jam and grinned with all his teeth, which counted as a medical report. "Well," he said to the heir, "that was educational." In the small hours after scolding and stitching and soup, the house settled. Eliza stood in the doorway of Gabriel's room, watching him yield to sleep the way proud men surrender only when no one is there to record it. She set the ridiculous wooden horse on his bedside table, a relic, a joke, a covenant. Then she leaned down and pressed her mouth to his bandaged temple, a kiss that asked nothing, promised everything, and tasted of ash and dawn. "Rest," she whispered. "We have a name to keep, and a heart to learn." He did not wake, but the line between his brows, where debt and duty made a habit of camping, eased. Outside, the last smoke lifted like incense that had finally remembered who it was for. The bells, having shouted, slept. Morning, somewhere past the orchard, rehearsed what it would say when it arrived, that some houses are saved by stone, some by water, and a few by a woman who refuses to let either define the end. Morning taught itself a gentler voice after the fire. It arrived without ceremony, steam rising from 2 cups, a sunbeam practicing its scales along the wainscot, the house breathing like a creature that had returned from a frightening dream. Merrow, which had once preferred posture to pulse, woke to find both possible at once. Servants spoke softly in corridors usually addicted to silence. The kitchen moved with the purposeful tenderness of a convalescent saint. In the ducal chamber, the new duke discovered that sleep, when earned by courage instead of arithmetic, does not accuse a man upon waking. Gabriel sat up slowly, the world a little tilted where the bandage pressed his temple into humility. On the table beside him stood a wooden horse of 1 wheel and absolute character. He stared at it as if it were an emblem on a shield he was only now permitted to carry. A knock, delicate as punctuation, announced Mrs. Salter with broth and a theology of blankets. "You will drink," she said, depositing the tray with the mercy of a general, "and you will refrain from heroics until I have finished being impressed. Her Grace is downstairs receiving gratitude you have not the strength to sustain." "Her Grace," he repeated, letting the title find its true weight. "Is she unsinged and unreasonably useful?" Mrs. Salter replied, softening in the way brick does when it remembers clay. "Eat." He obeyed. Convalescence is a lesson in paying attention. He learned that gratitude requires more muscles than pride, and that soup possesses the logic of forgiveness. When he dressed, each button felt like a promise not to waste what had been nearly lost. The mirror returned a face a little less sure of itself, and therefore, for the first time, worth listening to. He found Eliza in the small morning room, hair braided with a practicality that had begun to resemble beauty, hands busy with letters. There were many. A note from the vicar about funds for a new roof, a list from the matron of the orphan house cataloguing losses that could be mended and those that would become stories, 3 offers of help from ladies who preferred philanthropy to penance, and a neat column of expenditures Eliza meant to refuse because dignity wears better when paid for by the wearer. She looked up as he entered. The room altered by a degree, warmer, more intelligent. He stopped at the threshold, suddenly a guest in his own house and grateful for the invitation. "Eliza," he said. "Your Grace," she answered, and then, after a breath that remembered last night's ash and this morning's mercy, "Gabriel." He crossed to her, not as a duke claiming territory, but as a student asking leave to sit. "I have come to apologize," he said without rehearsal, "because practice would have made it cowardice. I mistook your courage for deceit, your generosity for insult, your partnership for injury to my dignity. I was wrong. I have been wrong for longer than this quarrel." She studied him, not to measure contrition, but to welcome it if it proved itself real. "You were afraid," she said, "and fear is very clever at pretending to be principle." "It has been my best tutor," he admitted. "I would like to be withdrawn from the class." A corner of her mouth considered leniency. "Very well. The course is expensive." "I know," he said, "for I have brought something toward the fee." From his pocket he produced a paper folded with the fastidiousness of a man who no longer trusts himself with flourish. He set it on the table between them and stepped back, as one does when introducing a friend to fire. She opened it. His neat accountant's hand had composed something that did not balance in columns, articles for a marriage repaired at Merrow Hall. Truth to be spoken promptly, even when unflattering to the speaker. Respect to be public habit and private law. Work to be shared according to skill, not vanity. Money to be accounted for like breath, necessary, honest, never a weapon. Service to those who cannot repay, counted as profit. Forgiveness renewed before breakfast when possible, by bedtime when necessary. Love to be practiced daily, defined as attention, not appetite. At the bottom he had left 2 lines for signatures and written a final clause in smaller script. Errors to be amended with tenderness. Amendments to be witnessed by Mrs. Salter, if she insists. Eliza laughed, that small, surprised sound that makes walls remember they were once trees. "Clause 7 is ambitious," she murmured. "I have married an ambitious woman," he said simply. "And I have become unwilling to live as a careful man when a good one is wanted." She set the page down as if it were something alive and therefore deserving of rest. "There is the matter of Rennick's letter," she said, "because the past does not vanish when the future knocks politely. I should have told you." "I made it impossible for you to tell me," he replied, and felt the truth brighten the room without heat. "I have written to Rennick the loan will be repaid slowly without selling land that feeds our people. I will invite scrutiny rather than concealment. If London wants a scandal, it may have the one where a duke learns to be decent in public." "And if London refuses to reward decency?" she asked, not to discourage, but to test the timber. "Then London may discover its creditors include me," he said dryly. "I owe you more than coin, but I will begin there." She reached for the pen that had been making lists all morning. "Very well," she said, "let us sign what we can keep and keep what we cannot yet sign." He offered his hand. She placed her fingers in his. Work roughened, soap dry, beloved precisely because of those facts, and they signed together. It felt less like law and more like liturgy. Gratitude, like fire, spreads when given fuel. The day became a procession of proof. Tenants came to the hall door with eggs and a shy, inconvenient pride. Children, scrubbed and indignant at having survived, presented drawings in which Gabriel wore a heroic hat he had never owned. Annie arrived with the one-wheeled horse and announced that it had recovered its nerves. She condescended to pat the Duke's bandage as if knighthood depended on her approval. Eliza arranged donations for the orphanage, not as charity, but as a budget. She accepted help only where it would not bruise the giver and refused it where it would bruise the receiver. Gabriel stood beside her and learned, in one afternoon, more about stewardship than his father's friends had taught him in 20 years. In the evening, while the kitchen rehearsed a stew it meant to remember, they walked the gardens. The roses, singed at the edges by an autumn that had decided to be honest, still threw fragrance like a last argument. Gravel agreed with their footsteps. The sky had put on that precise, transparent blue reserved for truces. "I kept your letter," Eliza said suddenly. "The one you wrote with your body last night when you put yourself between me and the falling wall." "I had poor penmanship," he replied. "I read it," she said, "and I intend to keep it." They reached the yew arch, where the path narrows enough that two people must decide whether to become a pair or take turns passing through. He paused. She did not move away. He took her hand as if applying to hold it, which is to say, reverently. "Eliza," he said, "I married you to save a name. It is a small thing to say I am grateful for your life. It is a larger thing to say I cannot imagine mine without you." He swallowed, discovering that courage has a taste. "Will you accept my love, belated and unpracticed, as part of your vast and inconvenient work?" Her eyes brightened, not the gloss of tears, but the shine of someone who has just found a truth where she expected only comfort. "Yes," she said, "on condition you will allow yourself joy without asking it to produce receipts." "I will attempt," he answered solemnly, which, for a man like him, was a vow already halfway to fulfillment. They stood beneath the arch as the first star decided not to be late. He bent, not in conquest, but in gratitude, and kissed her. It was not a kiss that demanded proof. It was the kind that makes a house decide to keep standing and a garden agree to bloom again next year. When they parted, the evening had committed to being kind. They returned to the hall by the long path, the one that shows you the windows where people you love are putting lamps into their places. Mrs. Salter met them at the door and pretended not to see what she had already prayed for. "Supper," she said, "and no arguments. I have seasoned the broth with agreement." After supper they sat with accounts between them and the wooden horse on the mantel. Gabriel read figures aloud. Eliza corrected his optimism. Together they built a budget that spent generously on roofs and schools and candles for the orphanage. When the last column balanced, he set down the quill and looked at the life they had drafted. "It is strange," he said. "I do not feel diminished by owing you everything." "You do not owe me everything," she replied. "Only the part that can be paid in attention." He smiled. "Interest I'm glad to owe." Before bed, they stepped once more onto the terrace. The night was clear, the stars numerous enough to make a man modest. He drew her close, not as a shield now, but as a place to stand. "There is something I must say as it wishes to be heard," he murmured, the words finally finding their order. "You saved my name, Eliza, but it was my heart you redeemed." She rested her head against his shoulder, as one does when the sentence is not a promise but a truth already at work. "Then keep it well, my lord," she said softly. "It bears my name now." The house, eavesdropping shamelessly, settled deeper on its foundations. In the village, hammers measured out a future on the frame of a new roof. Somewhere, a child tested a laugh the fire had failed to steal. And in the garden of Merrow Hall, a duke and a duchess, once strangers married by mathematics, learned the ordinary, daily art of spending themselves on one another until the accounts of pride were empty and the ledger of love finally in balance.